Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for ESS Synergy EX360 webinar number 1, the launch of 4-part webinar series. Today's session, 4-step to ignition control and EPCIC explosion protection roadmap, is designed for organizations involved in EPCIC delivery, fabrication, offshore facilities, and FPSO. A few quick housekeeping notes. This is a 45 minutes live session. Please, microphone are mute during the presentation. And please submit questions via Q&A or chat box. We will address them at the end. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Fern Rajaharis, CTO of ESS Synergy and company ES responsible person. Fern brings extensive experience supporting explosion protection and EX compliance across EPCIC projects, offshore asset and FPSOs, working closely with fabricators, offshore asset and with fabricator, operator and asset owners. Fern will be highlighting where projects commonly fail and what good practice really look like. With that, I will hand over to Fern. Over to you, Fern.
Thank you, Mimi. Thank you very much for the kind introductions. And let's dive straight in. Assalamualaikum. And a very good afternoon to everybody that is online with us today. Thank you for being here for our first of a 4-part series EX360 webinar. So, EX360, the Complete Explosion Protection Roadmap for EPCIC projects. Now, a lot of people, when we talk about EX, the first thing that pops into your mind is EX inspections. And to be honest, that's most people's relationship with EX equipment, right? You think about EX inspections and you think about how not to fail an EX inspection, but that's pretty normal. But for the most part, especially for practitioners of EPCIC projects, if you're into the detail engineering, you will realize that EX comes a lot earlier than just the operations and maintenance part, or at the end of commissioning where you start to think about inspections and initial inspections. Okay, so that's what we're here for. We're here to talk about how EX should be thought about in the entire life cycle of your equipment. Now, what's EX? Let's introduce a little bit of what is EX. EX, when we talk about EX, we're talking about explosion protection. And when we talk about explosion protection in the EX sense of things, we're talking about ignition control, right? And here's a story about how many offshore facilities operate for decades in a hazardous area or within an explosive atmosphere, just like the FPSO that I have on photo here. And it's not by luck if you think about how they are operating safely for decades on end, right? And one of the key things that they do well, and they do consistently well in, is ignition control. When we talk about EX equipment, we need to think about EX equipment as safety critical elements. And because they are safety critical elements as part of the ignition control, it's actually a preventative barrier. When you think about the bow tie of top events, right? It is the barrier that stops a top event. And in a top event, I mean a release of a flammable substance. And it stops it from turning into a major accident. If there was a release of a major substance, your EX equipment, which is considered a latent barrier, should prevent from becoming your ignition source. So in that sense, fire and explosion is then prevented. So the key here is successful safety, whether EX or otherwise, or in the bigger picture, right? Successful safety looks boring, actually. Explosion protection success is invisible. It's quiet because when it works, nothing happens. And that's exactly where we want to be. You want your EX equipment to work and nothing happens. From the business outcome angle, though, safety first, always. And when you have safety and a safety record that's pretty good, you have regulated confidence, you have your investor confidence, and of course, when it comes to the dollar and cents, you have high uptime and availability. In this particular case, this is a fleet by SBM Offshore, and consistently in their annual reports, SBM Offshore report 99.5% uptime. And we all know that uptime really is a correlation between stable, well-maintained, and an asset that requires less intervention. It also has a target that its entire fleet has a zero tier one process safety event. So that's when EX protection works, this is what it looks like, right? So what happens when EX protection doesn't work and ignition control gets out of control? This is what happened here. This is an event in 2023 of the Nohoch Alpha platform on the Cantarell field, Bay of Campeche in Mexico. And it's well known that this particular national oil company has a very poor safety record. In this particular case, in this Nohoch A explosion, there were immediately 2 fatalities and 1 missing. We will assume that the missing has already died. And there were 8 that were seriously injured. And in terms of the rest of the people that were offshore at the time, 321 people in total were evacuated across all these connected platforms. And what is the cost of something that's going wrong like this? Yeah, you might ask. In this particular case, there has been some range of estimates from the experts. And it ranges between, for this particular platform's incident, it ranges between the estimated cost of the event as US dollars 830 million to up nearly 1 billion US dollars. And that's the estimated cost in terms of the asset write-down and the damage, loss to production revenue, and debt and financing effects. We're not even talking about yet loss of life and insurance write-ups and also loss of reputation for this particular company, fortunately. I'd just like to conclude here that the best explosion protection story is the one that never becomes a headline. And that's where we want to be, right? Be boring and not become the headline. Fire, injury, asset loss, and legal exposure is not something you want to look forward to really when you are in asset integrity. Now, at the very beginning of our talk here, I'm going to just state at the very beginning, this is our pain point, right? These are the hidden risks when you talk about EX in EPCIC execution. What happens when you don't put EX as something critical that you have to solve at the beginning of EPCIC? First, you could get a design misalignment with the hazardous area classification. What does that mean? For example, you could have a hazardous area classification done right at the beginning of the project or at the feed stage. And at this point, your process design may not have had gone through a major freeze, or you could have had a design change that would change your source of release of equipment. And now, so your hazardous area classification that was done 6 months ago is no longer absolutely accurate. So you could end up with a design misalignment here. Next, you could get, when you come to a stage of procurement, you could get that the vendor's kit packages lack valid EX documentation. And we will dive into why that might be the case. And improper installation practices degrade EX integrity. To the best of your intentions, whatever has been your EX philosophy and procurement strategy, if you end up with EX equipment in the wrong hands, and when I say wrong hands, incompetent installers, people who are even unaware that EX certified equipment need expert handling and installation. And of course, this may also mean that they have missed the initial inspection of the EX equipment initial inspections. And then you come to a point that there's another hidden risk here, which is incomplete or missing EX verification dossier. Now, what is an EX verification dossier? When you get a piece of EX equipment, at the very least, and like any engineering equipment, if you like, or any industrial or equipment within our industry, you should be getting its data sheet, you should be getting its manual. But on top of that, because it's an EX equipment, you should be getting something called the certificate of conformity. And that certificate of conformity is its birth certificate, if you like, for that particular equipment. And it does give you traceability and clues along the way as to how this equipment should be installed and should be maintained and inspected throughout its complete life cycle. Now, missing information, and having gaps in your EX verification dossier, EVD, is of course a complete no-no. Companies that have a clean ignition or fire or explosion event record generally can show that they have a very good and auditable EX verification dossier trail. Let's get now into what I mean by the 7 steps, your EX roadmap for EX EPCIC. So I promised you 7 steps, right? First step being design and classification. Second being equipment selection. Third being procurement and vendor management. Fourth, installation. Fifth, inspection. Sixth, commissioning and verification. And finally, when you're done with your when you're done with the EPCIC stage, of course, you then hand over to O&M. Now, if you're in O&M, you will probably hope that the EPCIC contractor or your EPCIC colleagues hand over a complete engineering or engineered product and a complete set of documentation by which you are going to keep the fleet or your facility in the best of health, right? Let's go to the first step, which is design and classification. I'd already alluded to the hazardous area classification. And the person doing that is normally a process safety guy. It's a technical safety discipline. It's the correct identification of the flammable materials and the sources of release. And by doing that, by listing all of that, you then map out against your general equipment layout, the accurate hazardous area classification. This is where you will get your zone 0, zone 1, zone 2, or class or division 1 and 2, and things like that, depending on whether you're talking IEC or you're talking in UL or NZ terms. But of course, before any of that flammable material identification, hazardous area classification, you want to have a holistic EX management philosophy. Right? Oftentimes, I get this situation where I'll ask them, when was the last time you did an inspection? And the answer is, we've never done one. And we're like, okay, what does your company specification say? And then there's this very blank look. And it's not unheard of that some companies or facilities who are not so up to date on EX management may not have a usable EX management philosophy. And very often we've had to step in and get in there and really try to figure out, understand their facilities and create an EX management philosophy for them. So we've done this a couple of times there for our clients. Next comes, okay, now you've identified your hazard, and any safety professional will tell you that's the first step, right? Identifying your hazard, great. Now what do we do about it? Now, when you have electrical equipment, you want to ensure that the selection of your electrical equipment is done correctly. If you look at the picture on the right there, it might mean something to some of you who are already competent EX practitioners, but to most people, it just looks like gobbledygook, right? So what's EXE, 2C, T4, what's VTT, who's VTT, who's the IEC, who's the EX? So equipment selection requires some competency, I'd reckon some basic and fundamental knowledge about EX is pretty important to get to this stage. So you then have to then also verify whether your equipment comes with a proper certification. Now, what's your definition of a proper certification? Well, if your project or your national mandatory requirements of that particular country calls for IECEX, so be it, right? But in some countries, though, ETEX is still king. And ETEX came from a European directive and is still mandatory in all of the EU. But for the rest of the world, most countries have now adopted the IECEX. Now, one key point I'd like to mention here, when you talk IECEX and when you talk ATEX, those are certification schemes. That's a certification scheme to ensure that your equipment is certified to certain standards. But when we come to what would be the standards be for IECEX and ATEX, the answer is still, it's only based on one series of standards, and that's the IEC 60079. So this is the situation where you're already receiving, right? You're selecting equipment. So now you're receiving their certifications. You need to really understand how to match also your equipment protection level to the zone classifications that you've done before at the hazardous area classification stage of the project. Now, as you are getting in all your documentation from your suppliers and from your main contractors or from your module or skid builders, right? This is when you start to build your EX register. I know of quite a few leading FPSO companies who have a very good practice when it comes to EX registers. What they do is that they provide their main contractor or module fabricators with a set template for EX equipment data that they want in an Excel format. Then that then gets filled in by the fabricator or skid builder themselves, by the contractor. And then that gets submitted as part of their deliverable. And it might sound like it's a simple exercise. It is fundamentally, quite principally, quite fundamental. However, it's not as simple as it can be because not everybody is competent. There are differing expectations regarding what kind of equipment appears or doesn't appear in your EX register. And then there's also the whole convoluted matter that some people do not really fully understand EX, even in its most fundamental forms, to be able to do this competently, right? So that's where you kind of have to think about the push to get someone who understands EX better to perhaps help you along the way with this. This is also the point of the project that when you are already receiving equipment data sheets and equipment information from your vendors to create something called the EX verification dossier. And that's the document control part of this. It's not purely just document control, though. When you're getting EX documents, you also need someone who is actually an EX competent engineer to verify and review the data that you're getting or review the documents that you're getting is exactly as per required under the IEC 60079-14 and how to select equipment, right? What's acceptable? What's a certificate with a suffix U? Oh, I've got a certificate here. It has a suffix X. Or I have a certificate here that looks like an EPCIC certificate, but I don't know if it's fake or isn't. So those are some of the questions, if you like, for people who are not yet seasoned practitioners of EX engineering, right? So that's quite a bit on equipment selection and trying to get that right. And that's your second step. Now I go into my third step, which is now we've selected our equipment. What about our procurement and vendor management? You validate the data that you are provided from the vendor. You then track your certification data per equipment. You need to start completing your EX verification dossier. And then you have also vendor package verification and FAT witnessing, right? So if you have a fabricator that you trust and they understand EX, well and good. However, a lot of skid fabricators are very good at what they do with the civil structures, with the M&E part of things, but not necessarily very well versed in EX matters, which can be a very niche knowledge, I suppose, if I can put it that way. So there's there normally is some friction here between expectation of companies that want EX verification dossiers done well and EX documents done well versus what is actually provided by suppliers and main contractors. This becomes a source of friction. Right, now you've done with the buying, we've gone shopping, let's start to install these things, right? So you come to your skid fabricator, and what they should know and what they should practice, and I'm still in the IEC world here, is that the installation practice should be as per IEC 60079-14. Now, if you're familiar with 7914, well and good. It's for selection and it's for installation of EX equipment. It's no good that you buy the best EX equipment, you've paid an arm and a leg for an EX motor when an industrial motor that is exactly the same nameplate capacity costs, only 20% of what your EX motor might cost. But when you fall down at having a trained installer and the competency to understand what they have received and how they're going to install it properly, that's when you get friction during your initial inspections with your clients' EX inspectors, right? So some of the key things that people need to start thinking about is you are the people that are going to install, which means you are also another gate. You are the gatekeeper against installing wrong equipment. For example, if you have the updated hazardous area classification and you look at the equipment that has been provided, has been selected according to the hazardous area classification documents that came out earlier in the project, and now the classification has changed for that particular area, you're also the gatekeeper, actually, right? And you need to maintain the integrity of the selection and the installation of all the glands and the seals and enclosures and all the electrical equipment that you have received from your client. No, sorry, from your vendor. And this is so that you can keep your client happy at the end of your installation. Now comes your client during inspection, right? So in an ideal world, you want to come to this point where everything's good and you're approved and it's all sealed and ready to go. But before you get to that, you already conducted a detailed pre-commissioning EX inspection, and that EX inspection is normally as per IEC 60079-17. And then you then record the findings and what will be the corrective measures. So you now need to manage all your non-conformances, and that so systematically and with photographic evidence. Normally, that's what people want right now. And then you need to think also about your preservation for transport, right? what can I put in there? How do I preserve all these equipment properly and all this? So it's on you. And the sixth step is when you have already integrated it and you've coming to the point of commissioning and verification at site. So you need now, in theory, right? Well, in an ideal world, you should have a complete EX register and you should be now in the completion of your EX verification dossier. And that dossier should now also include your installation records and your inspection records of your initial inspection. Having done that only, that then becomes a happy handover to your O&M team. This is when also you verify for the last time your certificates, your as-built drawings, and all the inspection data that you've received so far. And this is also where you ensure each and every EX tag equipment has complete traceability from documentation to traceability at site. For example, it's actually a tagged item, it's a tagged equipment, and it tallies also with your general arrangement for that skid or module. Now I come to the seventh step, which is now the handover, the happy handover to the operations and maintenance, right? And when you come into operations and maintenance, you're into this realm of talking about, okay, what's our periodic inspection schedule? Is it a 3-year periodic? Is it going to be an initial inspection? When? What kind of grade of inspection is it going to be? Are we going to apply a risk-based approach to all our inspections now? And this is when using a digital EX management system for the life cycle integrity really comes into its own. You remember the EX register that we created during engineering phase? So now the EX register should be complete and completely handed over. And then comes your seamlessness in operating and maintaining your EX assets for the lifetime of that asset life cycle. The benefits will be a reduced downtime. You have now an assured compliance and continuous improvement that's built into your whole life cycle philosophy. Let's come into a case study where an end-to-end exclusion protection compliance in an ideal case would look like, right? So your scope would begin at design verification. Normally, an engineering design house will give you all your engineering design documents, right? You've come to a point where you've already now inspected something and it goes into a digital EX register. So when you are in the compliance stage, your equipment documentation has to be complete, your inspection has to be by competent people, and then ideally you want it all in a digital EX register and a digital format for best accessibility of those documents when you for those data when you really need it offshore. And the outcomes should be that you are in a zero NCR phase, it's a faster turnaround, and you have a full life cycle traceability of your EX equipment. Imagine this EX equipment will be outdoors in a saline environment, operating for 20 or 25 years, depending on your asset life cycle. At EXS Synergy, we have digitalized the EX inspection phase and EX maintenance phase of taking care of EX equipment. So Intellect is actually a Malaysian product, very proud of Malaysian. We built it here in Cyberjaya, where I'm sitting right now in our office in Cyberjaya. And it was harnessed over 1.5 million man-hours of actual data from our inspection and maintenance activities that we've carried out since 2014. And it was developed in-house here by EX professionals, and it is for EX professionals, and it's in full compliance with the IEC 6079. And especially proud for us is actually that we have embedded a risk-based inspection algorithm into Intellects. And it is our proprietary algorithm using data analytics for all the data that we've received throughout the time that we've been an inspection company. All right, so I'd like to introduce a concept called Ex360. I think throughout the session today, it's pretty clear that you would have to think about EX holistically in a manner that is covering every aspect of your equipment and throughout its life cycle, and not only at the end as an inspection checklist, only when you have a problem, or even worse, only when an incident has occurred. So EX here stands for explosion protection, and the 360 represents our view of a complete life cycle service from the strategy of your EX, your philosophy, to your EPCIC, and through to safe and operable O&M stage. So in the EX360 world, we're thinking about doing things right from the engineering, procurement, and installation stage. We're thinking of doing it right at inspection, initial inspection, periodic inspection, inspections with RBI, for example. So rectifications and upgrade as well. I mean, imagine having an EX lighting, for example, on your project, but the change management of that company has no competent EX engineer and doesn't even understand the complications or the complexities of selecting a replacement for that lighting. We've seen that before, where people had gone to buy industrial lighting to replace EX lighting in a painting booth, for example. That's a real life example of what I've seen myself. And then with something like Intellects, a digital EX asset compliance management system is something that's going to keep all your data, all your photos, and that will be your historical and auditable and traceable data that will be useful when you come up against a safety audit, for example. And then there's also situations where packages, kit builders, even enclosure packages come up against problems with certification and require consultancy. So that's also something that we've covered over the years that we've done, that we are in EX. And last but not least, I truly, truly believe that good EX begins with good EX competent people, and therefore training and development is actually a very core of our business, where we feel that everybody involved with an explosive atmosphere needs to be able to get and access quality training and development to increase their EX competencies. So here in Malaysia, normally it's the IECEX COPC that people are looking for, and that's also part of the service that we have here at EXS Synergy. Some key takeaways, if you like, for today's session: that explosion protection is life cycle based. It's also very dependent on competency and complete documentation, without which you will not have EX compliance. Digitalization ensures long-term sustainability. You will have real access, quick access, and accurate documentation and records of your EX activities regarding every activity that you've done on each EX equipment. I'll give you an example. What FPSO players were calling Generation 1 or Generation 2 FPSOs, they had at the time, and this was considered revolutionary already, 7,000 EX equipment on that particular topsides. The latest large topsides that we're looking at now in 2025, 2026, we're looking at topsides having in excess of 35,000 35,000 EX equipment. Can you imagine having 35,000 EX equipment to deal with? And an EX verification dossier may have 3, 4, or even 5 documents per dossier at the minimum. And so you're dealing with 35,000 times 5 EX related data. So no, if people ask me, is it dot control? No, it's not just dot control. You have to coordinate the data. You have to understand the data, put it in a way that's accessible, and put it in a way that is meaningful, and then analyze what you've got. So having correct EX database will ensure your success in the long term for the next phases of a project, which is O&M. And there you have it. That's my 7-step roadmap that keeps EPCIC aligned and auditable for your projects. So if you found that this particular webinar has been useful for you and you have gained some insights within this webinar, then you might enjoy the rest of the webinars that we have planned throughout 2026. Okay. So I'm going to go to the next page where there's a little questionnaire. So if you've enjoyed this session, please can you spend the next 2 minutes answering some of the questions in the questionnaire. It's not too difficult. And I'd like to ask my colleague Koyim, are there any questions in the Q&A? Okay. So far, there are no questions asked in the Q&A. It must either mean that the explanation has been so good that there are no questions, or maybe, you're still thinking of your questions. But anyway, please get in touch with the Access Synergy. You can get in touch with us through I prefer LinkedIn normally myself, but of course, emails and the contact is QR there will take you to my colleague Mimi. And we're always ready to take care of people's ex. So let's talk about your biggest EX challenges in EPCIC execution. So you can book a free consultation or a proof of concept for a trial of intellects. Or we could partner with the Access Synergy for end-to-end EX lifecycle assurance. Okay. So with that, if there are no questions, Koyim, within the question box, in the chat box, okay. And with that, I thank you very much for being here with us, and I hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fen. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope today's session has given you practical insight into how ignition control and explosion protection should be managed across the EPCIC life cycle. Today's webinar is the first of 4 sessions in ESS Synergy's Ex360 webinar series planned for 2026. The upcoming session will cover topics such as EX certification, managing EX integrity, and applying EX principle to emerging areas such as hydrogen facilities. We will be sharing details of the next session soon. On behalf of ESS Synergy, thank you for your time and participation today. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the upcoming months. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.